Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the next chapter in our series of aquaculture-related webinars designed to bring together science and business to expand and strengthen the United States aquaculture industry. These webinars are a joint effort between the National Aquaculture Association, the North Central Regional Aquaculture Center, and the United States Aquaculture Society. Whether you're currently engaged in aquaculture, looking to get into business, an educator helping others understand aquaculture, or you just want to become a better educated consumer. We hope that these webinars will enhance your knowledge and move you forward on your journey to success. Today's webinar is presented by Dr. Carol Engle. Dr. Engle is a member of an elite set of world-renowned aquaculture economists who help us attach the dollars and cents to our aquaculture production endeavors. Dr. Engle has more than 35 years of aquaculture experience and has published numerous scientific articles. She's also a world traveler and has worked with a variety of species and production systems. Today she'll share with us the results of a novel study that examined the economic costs of the strict regulations placed on the bait and sportfish industries. She's also developing similar studies to examine how regulations affect the cost of doing business in the trout and West Coast shellfish industries. Carol, thanks for taking time with us today to share some of your wisdom and providing us with hard numbers to help us make sound business decisions. And for those of you that might be interested, our next webinar will be on October 12th and will focus on branding opportunities for oyster farmers. Dr. Bill Walton, an extension specialist and Auburn University professor, will share some of his experiences on adding value to oysters through branding. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Carol. Take it away.
Thank you, David, and welcome to everybody joining us on this webinar here today. What I'd like to do in this webinar is to first paint a little bit of a context that led us to developing this research initiative to measure on-farm costs associated with regulations for aquaculture businesses. Then I'm going to share with you the highlights of the recently completed study. That's the first study that, to my knowledge, has been done that's specific to the U.S. bait and sportfish industry. Then I'll just share a little bit about the two follow-up studies that are currently underway. We have one on the West Coast right now where we're interviewing shellfish farmers on the West Coast in terms of their regulatory issues, and we're gearing up and designing a study that we'll launch after the first of the year to do the same thing with the trout industry across the United States. If you look at this graph, what we can see on this graph is the rate of growth of aquaculture. The line at the top, the blue line, shows the rate of growth of world aquaculture. The orange line shows the rate of growth of U.S. aquaculture. We can see clearly from this graph that aquaculture in the United States has been growing much more slowly than that of aquaculture globally. More disturbing is the fact that there has been a decline in U.S. aquaculture that you can see clearly from this graph. The United States is listed and reported to be the 15th largest aquaculture producer in the world, yet that ranking does not match the kinds of resources that we have in the United States. With the level of resources that we do have in the United States, the U.S. really should be a major aquaculture producer and at the top. To exacerbate this overall situation is that the United States runs a fairly substantial annual trade deficit in the seafood that it purchases. We've already seen how the data show that we're growing more slowly than in other countries around the world and also in a state of decline. This decline of U.S. aquaculture has been attributed to some degree to the increased feed costs that began back in 2008, increased pressure from low-cost imports. The feed costs have come down somewhat, and so that's been ameliorated to some extent. However, increasingly, more individuals are paying attention to the effects of the regulatory environment in terms of what this means for growth of aquaculture, not just in the United States, but in other countries as well. If you're a producer and you're looking out at the regulatory environment across the United States, what it often seems like to most producers is that we have this curtain of regulations that they have to contend with. An important point that I'm going to share that's one of the bottom lines of this first study that we've completed on the U.S. bait and sportfish industry. One of the important bottom lines that we learned in this study is that the real issue with regulations is that farmers have to report the same sorts of information to multiple agencies in multiple states all at the same time. What we found is a tremendous amount of redundancy, overlap, and duplication that really is at the root of the problems that the regulatory environment in the United States is creating for baitfish people. As one example, baitfish and sportfish growers ship live fish across state lines in order to ensure other states that their fish are healthy and are not transmitting a disease. A lot of testing is done and certificates and permits are issued. A baitfish producer then will have to get a permit for every state they ship to, and in some cases 2 or 3 permits in a state, all requiring the same information, which means double and triple the paperwork for any shipment. I say this because this is sort of the context of what U.S. aquaculture growers are facing. Other studies have identified over 1,000 laws that affect aquaculture in the United States and with which U.S. aquaculture growers must be in compliance. Now, before we get into the real highlights of the study that we recently completed, I do want to point out that neither I nor my collaborators, nor the fish farmers and shellfish growers we've been interviewing, none of us are interested in going back to the day when our waters were so polluted that rivers would catch on fire. No one is interested in going back to the days of abusive child labor in the United States. We know from the field of economics, we understand that pollution often is an externality that spills over, and that laws and regulations are necessary in order to internalize those costs and manage those costs. So the entire topic of this webinar is not about eliminating regulations. It's really dealing with the core problem that is really a set of overlapping, redundant regulations across multiple agencies that are promulgated with the very best of intentions, but end up in it creating an atmosphere that has increased costs, the kinds of costs that we're going to take a look at here. In the research literature, we're starting to see research emerge on this kind of an issue. 2013, Nathan Stone and I wrote a paper that was more of a review of regulations of aquaculture, and we also looked more broadly at agriculture. We see a growing literature looking at effects of the regulatory environment of agriculture and other businesses in the United States as well. But this is not an issue that's restricted to the United States. Ash and Roll, in a paper also published in 2013, showed that the development of salmon aquaculture in Norway was affected negatively by the regulatory environment in Norway. In a recent paper published earlier this year, Abati et al. Looked across 90-some different countries across the world. They developed an index of the level of stringency of regulations and then related that back to growth of aquaculture. Well, it's not surprising that the United States rated very high on the index of the stringency of regulations, but it also rated very low in aquaculture growth. They found that relationship across the 90-some countries that they studied in that particular paper. The paper that Nathan and Stone and I wrote really pulled together literature that showed it's not any one regulation that's causing the issues and the problems on fish farms, but rather it's this total set of regulations, and that we really needed to understand how that plays out on farms and how that affects costs of production on individual farms is what was needed. In addition to this, as we talked with individuals who were interested in attempting to begin to try to streamline regulations related to aquaculture, what we often heard was the comment that when they talked with regulators, a regulator would say, well, the permit only costs $50, or it costs $100, or maybe the permit is even free. And so what's the big deal? Well, as we'll see as we move into this, what farmers were saying was that the big deal is all the other things that they have to do on farms. And so what emerged from these conversations was a real need to capture and dig into these regulatory costs on farms and what effect the entire set of regulations is having on these farms that work so hard to be in compliance with regulations. So that's what launched this particular study. And the paper that Nathan and Stone and I wrote, we identified from the literature these 6 categories of regulations that were clear from the literature. Again, what's important is to look at the total effect of all these regulations at the farm level and the cost of production. This seemed to be the gap in information and what was missing in this entire discussion. There's no question that changes in the cost of production will affect supply. There's no question that these regulations probably affect efficiency of production. There's no question that they also affect the market and industry level. But until we get the basic information of how these kinds of regulations play out at the farm level, we cannot really begin to look at some of these other effects that happen. So we decided to tackle this issue at the farm level and try to measure the effects of regulations on farms in the United States. When I use the word we, my partners and collaborators in this need to be recognized. Jonathan Van Senten took on this topic of looking at the costs of regulations on baitfish and sportfish farms in the United States as the topic for his dissertation. He currently, today, is out on the West Coast interviewing shellfish growers as a postdoc now at Virginia Tech University. He's following up this work with the Shellfish Study, and then we'll be moving on to the trout studies that I'll mention in a little bit. Our other very important partner in this first study that's been completed has been the USDA-APHIS agency that is very interested in looking at aquatic animal health issues. They've also been very interested in working to try to streamline some of these regulatory issues related to aquatic animal health. They've been working with the National Aquaculture Association to try to do this. And so they came on board and have helped us provide funding and have helped work with us as a partner in this overall initiative. So to talk about the Baitfish Sportfish survey that we did, the 13 states that are highlighted on your screen in blue are the 13 states that we targeted for this. We designed the study as a census, meaning we did not draw a sample. We made every attempt to contact every bait and sportfish grower in these 13 states. At the end of the survey, we ended up with, in our data set, a data set that represents 74% of the baitfish and sportfish production across the United States. We had excellent participation, and I cannot thank those producers enough for taking the amount of time that they took to dig out the numbers and to help provide the data so that we could complete this analysis. We collected a great deal of data. That's a very large and very complex data set that we collected, and we only have time today to talk about some of the highlights. We did collect some data on farm size and characteristics of the farms. Some of the agriculture literature related to regulations, especially some studies out of California on California vegetable farms and fruit farms, showed that farm size had a significant effect on the overall impact that the regulatory costs had on them, with the smaller farm sizes suffering to a disproportionate degree in terms of greater costs. We also asked farmers to provide lists of all the different regulations that they had to comply with, and also asked about the frequency of renewal and the number of times they had to renew the permits and licenses that they were required to have. We spent quite a lot of time talking about the costs that these incurred on their farms and how these costs were incurred on their farms and what kinds of costs were related to be able to estimate and calculate an average cost of regulations on farms. We also looked at things like whether the regulatory costs were variable costs and varied with production, or were they fixed costs that the farms would have to deal with. So we looked at those kinds of breakdowns as well. We related these costs back to farm size to be able to see if our results would be similar to those of some of the studies on agricultural farms. And then we also divided the regulatory costs into these different categories that I showed earlier to try to determine which type of regulation was causing the greatest costs on farms. I put this slide on here to show you that we did have enough data from individual farms to be able to report some of the results by individual states. And so, as you see here, there are a number of individual states where we had adequate observations and responses. In the other category, we are including the states within which we did not have enough observations to be able to report the data by state and maintain confidentiality. We also divided this out by farm size. So to summarize this, these are the numbers of regulations and the numbers of renewals that do vary by state, but we're talking here today about the national averages. We found across U.S. Baitfish and Sportfish farms that they were complying with 498 different regulations. The vast majority of these are state regulations. I think we all recognize that states are enforcing federal regulations, so these are tied with various federal regulations that have been promulgated, in addition to some that are state-specific. On average, farms had to deal with 13 renewals of permits on average each year. We had some farms that had as many as 203 renewals in a given year. That number is not really an outlier. We had a number of farms that had as many as 150 or more of regulations and renewals every year. If we look at the average regulatory cost per farm, we can again see that we had enough responses to the average regulatory cost per farm to be able to report this by individual state. There is quite a lot of variation by state. On a national basis, you can see that the average cost was just under $150,000 per farm. On a per acre basis, this comes down to just under $3,000 per acre. I've looked at enough farm records over time to know that costs of $3,000 per acre are substantial costs on any aquaculture farm across the United States. So to answer the question of how much of the bait and sportfish farming costs are due to regulations, was 25% of total costs. So we look at 25% of total costs in the baitfish and sportfish industry. There isn't a great deal of feeding that occurs, and so any cost that's 25% of total cost is a major cost to a U.S. baitfish or sportfish farm. However, that's not the entire story in terms of what we've learned from this study. The other part of this is a lot of the regulatory costs entered the farm's expenses as fixed costs. The way to manage increased fixed costs, of course, is to increase the production volume and sell additional product to spread those fixed costs over a greater volume of production. We also found in this study, however, that the same regulations that increased costs were also preventing access to a number of different markets. Some farms had, due to regulations, to back out of certain markets. In other cases, farmers have decided to not sell into certain states, primarily due to fear of Lacey Act violations that might occur due to a paperwork violation, or in some cases, with things going on within states, a permit that is not made available to them in a timely fashion. If there's some sort of delay, they don't have that on the truck, they might be subject to a Lacey Act violation. Those of you familiar with the Lacey Act know that the fines are very severe, up to $500,000. And not only that, there's mandatory jail time involved in Lacey Act violations for what often can be characterized as honest mistakes of paperwork. So these costs of regulation are really twofold, that we have an increased total cost, but then farms are being prevented from dealing with those increased costs in the way that would make the most sense to them. When we add up the costs across all the different states and we adjusted it for the total U.S. volume of production based on the most recent census of aquaculture, we find that the farm level costs were over $12 million a year to the U.S. baitfish and sportfish industry of regulatory costs. It should be noted on this, and it's important to note that this is not an economic impact. This is a direct farm level cost. In order to get to an economic impact, this number of 12.1 million would need to be multiplied by an appropriate multiplier to get to an economic impact. So what types of costs do regulations create? When we look at this pie chart, we can see that permits and licenses composed 1% of the costs of regulation. So the results of this study show that the regulators who said that the cost of the permit is not a big deal are correct, and our study results support that. The cost of the permits is not a big deal, and it's not a major cost. But the costs are high, and the costs are due to all of these other indirect costs that are associated with changes that the farms have to make to be in compliance with all of these different regulations that they have. In addition to that, if you look at these total costs, our study results show that 11% of those costs are due to manpower costs. Every one of those permits and renewals has to be filled out by someone. Every time a report is due, someone has to take time to do that. The amount of time can be substantial, and it takes people away from selling their product, takes them away from innovations that they should be attempting to implement on their farms and other sorts of things. In some cases, farms had to hire additional manpower, additional employees, simply to comply with all of the testing, monitoring, and reporting that had to be done. We do feel that the costs of manpower are underestimated because we did not meet any farmers who recorded every hour or two that they spent on the phone trying to find out who in an agency was able to send them an application form or trying to find their permit that had not been processed, or to try to follow up with all of these things. So this is the kind of thing that farmers are spending a tremendous amount of time on. The big portion of these costs in the baitfish and sportfish industry are in this category of lost or foregone sales. And so this is the big category of farmers that have backed out of markets for the reasons I mentioned earlier, or have lost access to markets, sales that they used to have, so they had records about what those sales were to different states that they, for a variety of regulatory issues and reasons, have decided to back out of. So the bottom line of this is that the direct costs of the permits are 1% of the total costs, and the indirect costs are 99% of all of those costs. We wanted to break these down by these costs and compare them across farm size. As would be expected, large farms had a total regulatory cost that was the greatest. However, when we put these costs of regulations on a per acre basis, we see the reverse. We see a very high cost per acre on the smaller farms, much higher than for the medium and large scale farms. When I look at this and I think back to the census of aquaculture, if we look at the 2005 census of aquaculture and compare the number of small-scale aquaculture businesses to that of the most recent aquaculture census, if we do that, we see that in the United States, we are losing a lot of our small aquaculture businesses. When I look at this kind of number, I have to think that this has to be at least a part of the reason why we seem to be losing our small-scale businesses in the United States. We also took the regulatory costs and divided those by these 6 different categories. For baitfish and sportfish, of course, there are really only 5. This is not a food product, and so those regulations are not relevant. You can see when we did this that the regulatory category that incurred the greatest amount of cost was in the environmental management regulatory category, followed by fish health. The greatest number of regulations was in the number of permits and renewals to be able to culture a fish farming permit or an aquaculture permit, and yet those permits represented only 1% of the total cost, with environmental costs, environmental regulatory costs, and fish health regulatory costs being the largest cost categories for regulations. Well, is this useful? So we know what this is costing farms, and what can these data be used for? I'll give you possibly two examples here today to talk about it. As I mentioned earlier, in the baitfish sportfish industry, it's the fish health regulations that are especially frustrating and especially costly. A lot of the permits that they are required to get to ship live fish to other states have to do with proving that their fish are healthy. I've already mentioned how redundant this is. The diseases that are being tested for tend to be the same across many different states. Different states require different sample sizes and other sorts of things. And so they're providing information for the same concerns and providing the same information, but doing it multiple times to different states across the United States. USDA-APHIS has been working with the National Aquaculture Association to develop a uniform set of standards for aquatic animal health. Think what this might mean if a veterinarian that took a sample of fish from a farm would log that into a single website. If the laboratory that does the testing to see if these fish are free of diseases would log that information onto a central website, the fish health professional that's overseeing the entire process also logs in and approves it electronically. The farmer can then enter in the states that they would like to ship to, and that would be done electronically. Those states could then approve the permit based on what they receive electronically, could approve that electronically, and then the farmers could download the permits from those individual states. I think you could begin to see how much time that would save on farms. So what we did, that's the kind of possibility that a CAHPS kind of program might provide. We did have a focus group with baitfish and sportfish growers and identified not just the benefits of a CAHPS program, the potential benefits, but we also identified potential additional costs. Some farms are not testing for fish health, and some states do not require it. If that were required for them to participate, their costs would go up, and we also estimated all of that. I won't show you all the results. We have manuscripts that will be coming out with the details later on. But we did one scenario where we combined all of the benefits and all of the costs that we identified, and we compared it with the current situation. So as you can see, there is potential to reduce these regulatory costs per farm from that just under $150,000 per farm per year down to about $66,000 per farm per year, cutting those costs nearly in half. Now this is sort of a maximum potential kind of scenario. The extent to which these costs would really go down would vary, of course, by the number of states that would buy into this system and participate in the program in the system. But the bottom line and the message here is that streamlining regulations does have potential to dramatically reduce these costs that farmers are incurring while maintaining the high level of quality that we want to have in our environment in the United States. So we think this shows that there is potential to do this. We've been talking to quite a few individuals and presenting these results, and we'll continue to work on doing that. I wanted to share with you just a few of the comments that we've heard. We had one regulator say, I had no idea that it was costing that much on farms. So again, these kinds of data are opening a few eyes and showing where the costs are occurring on farms and the extent to which this is a serious problem for U.S. aquaculture businesses. Another regulator said, I didn't know it was taking up so much of their time. You know, each individual who works in a regulatory agency is concerned with their regulations that they're authorized to pay attention to. And so there are multiple agencies that are requiring different kinds of actions on farms. And one agency may not be aware what the other agencies are doing. And it's this total set of regulations that's making it so difficult. And of course, one regulator said, no wonder they are unhappy with us. And so I think the information is useful. There's clearly a lot of interest in this kind of information as well. At one meeting, in one presentation, there was an individual who worked for a state agency in a state in the United States who stood up and said, you know, if we could really streamline regulations, this might dramatically reduce our costs within our state agency, because often we have unfunded mandates to regulate and to develop new regulations, but no additional funding to do so. If we really streamline some of this, there may be an opportunity to reduce costs to state agencies as well. So to summarize what we found in the Baitfish Sportfish study that has been completed, we estimated the total cost to the industry of $12 million per year, strictly farm costs, not the total economic impact, just under $150,000 cost per farm, just under $3,000 per acre. A very high percent of the regulations were state regulations. The permits and licenses are only 1% of regulatory costs. The big problem and the bulk of the costs are in all of these other indirect costs of how the farms have to comply with these regulations and the time they have to spend. The costs per acre are much higher on smaller farms, and the most expensive regulatory categories are the environmental management and fish health categories. These results show clearly that the regulatory burden that's faced by baitfish and sportfish growers in the U.S. is substantial. There's little room for doubt that it is increasing costs on farms. It's restricting access to markets. It's preventing farms from doing what they need to do to be able to spread those costs and to reduce their fixed costs from these regulations. And we've also learned that there is potential for streamlining through the scenario that we look at of a uniform model for aquatic animal health to reduce costs. But I think there's potential for other streamlining of other sorts of regulations that should be looked at to try to work through ways to reduce the redundancy and overlap in the regulatory environment. I mentioned that at the outset that we are looking at the same sort of issue with shellfish on the West Coast and getting ready to begin to do this for the trout industry as well. If we look at this project, just take a minute to show where we're headed on this particular project. This project is funded by the Western Regional Aquaculture Center, specifically to look at shellfish on the West Coast and trout on the West Coast. Our team looking at the effects of regulations on U.S. aquaculture has expanded now with this project to include extension personnel like Gary Fornshell, Fred Connie, Bill Hunt Shoemaker, and Michael Schwartz, as well as industry people like Bobby Hudson and Bill Dewey. Our project monitor who keeps us on track is Gunnar Knapp. And so we have an excellent team of people gearing up to do this as well. If you ask whether shellfish will have the same degree of costs as U.S. baitfish and sportfish, this chart that was prepared by shellfish growers on the West Coast shows the processes and all the permits that shellfish growers have to obtain and monitor and manage and renew on the West Coast. So I suspect, and based on survey data so far and responses so far, we suspect that these costs are going to be considerable on the West Coast for shellfish as well. In order to estimate these costs and to measure these costs, we're in the midst of a survey for shellfish. Jonathan is in Washington, the state of Washington right now, interviewing shellfish growers, and the survey will include Oregon and California as well. The Western Region Aquaculture Center also funded a trout survey for the Western region for the 5 states of California, Colorado, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. Yet there's tremendous interest in this topic. And so given the need to really look at this on a very comprehensive basis, USDA-APHIS has also joined in and provided funding to expand the trout survey to include 6 additional states, are the states in green on this map. The red states are the ones funded by the Western Regional Center, and the 6 green states are funded by APHIS. APHIS is also interested in including salmon in this project, and so now with the APHIS funding, we're going to include salmon farms as well in this particular project. And then the U.S. Trout Farmers Association has also contributed funding to expand and add 5 additional states that are in blue on your map. So with these states that are highlighted on the map now, these states represent about 99% of the value of trout sold nationally and about 87% of the trout farms across the United States. So we are able now to talk about a national survey and looking to do this. We're designing the study right now and developing it, and we plan to launch the trout survey after the first of the year. One point I do want to make about the trout study. In the trout study, we will be including both producers of trout sold into recreational markets and producers of trout food fish as well. In the Baitfish Sportfish survey, we excluded trout growers who were selling into recreational markets, knowing that there was a great deal of interest from the trout industry to have one set of numbers that reflected the entire trout industry in the United States. So we will be looking at including trout sold into recreational markets in the upcoming National Trout Survey. So we're hoping a year from now that we'll have estimates of both shellfish regulatory cost effects on shellfish on the West Coast as well as on trout nationally. I'd like just to take a minute to provide a very special thank you to all of the Baitfish and Sportfish producers who participated in that study, and all the shellfish growers who have already responded to our shellfish survey, and especially for trusting Jonathan and I to maintain the confidentiality of their data, and for spending the time and effort that they did to dig out out of their records and provide the data that we needed to complete this project. I'd like to especially thank USDA-APHIS for the funding support that has enabled us to do this in a comprehensive way, and they continue to do that given the importance of this topic across the United States. We had a lot of help from a lot of people on the Baitfish and Sportfish project that I'll show here, and we very much appreciate and thank every individual who provided the support for that project.